So first of all, let me ask Rebecca, unmute yourself, and if you.
Hi everyone, I'm so excited to be
Hi.
here.
Hi, Rebecca.
So Rebecca, you can see this is the group here. They're all very intellectually curious, friendly people.
I teach a large gateway course and I have never seen so many videos on, so I appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. So let me tell you a little bit about Rebecca. You know, I cruised the university asking department chairs and deans who would be really good in your area to give a talk to OLLI. And Rebecca's name came up several times. So I said, we need to get this woman to talk to us. And of course, it's had to be postponed because of COVID, but finally now it's all coming together. So Rebecca grew up around Phoenix, Arizona, and she went to school at the University of Arizona for multiple degrees. As it turns out, she got her bachelor's degrees there and then stayed on to get an MA. She got very interested in psychology and social psychology and continued with a PhD. Interesting part of her career is at one point, after she'd gotten her PhD, they asked her to be part of their education abroad program, and she taught in Italy for several years, which is pretty interesting. Did a postdoc at the same university as our incoming president, the University of Delaware. They did not overlap at all. And then in the year 2015, only 6 years ago, we were able to get Rebecca to come here as a new professor in psychology. And although she's only been here 6 years, she is now a tenured professor, associate professor, Rebecca Covarrubias. So let me just say, a number of years back, I gave a talk in this general meeting, and my title was Teaching College Biology. And my goal was to tell you what it was really like to teach in a college class. And I remember saying, you know, when all of us in our age group went to school, we thought about college kids. The image was Joe College. Do you remember the Joe College image? White guy in a sports coat with leather patches on the elbows. And I was making the point that if you look out in a UCSC classroom, it's not Joe College anymore, not at all. And this is very much the heart of Rebecca's work, because people are coming from all parts of American society, and they approach their education very differently in ways that I don't think all of us really think about. One challenge we've had in OLLI, and we've talked about it, is we in OLLI are not a diverse group, and we would really like to be more so than we are. But it's really interesting to hear what the diversity of our society means in terms of questions like, how do people get educated? And that's Rebecca's story, and I'm going to let Rebecca tell it. Rebecca.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor and pleasure to be here and just hear how maybe some parts of the stories that I'll share today might resonate with your own, and in some places where maybe they don't resonate. And I think those are sort of the personal kinds of meaning making, I think, that are really great for conversation and discussion and learning more about who our students are right now at UC Santa Cruz. And so before I share my slides, I'll just let you know that while I'll talk about the research work, I am going to embed a lot of student voices so that you can just hear what students are grappling with, what they bring to the university campus, and hopefully to humanize and personalize more of what our students are right now, and why I have such great pleasure, I think, in it being a place at UC Santa Cruz. I mean, I've been at many institutions, and this is by far the most diverse campus. It's incredibly, I think, forward thinking in terms of social justice and diversity, but also recognizing that there's places that we can improve, obviously, and the students are not shy about letting us know where that is. And so I feel very grateful to be able to work with them and to share some of that work that we've been doing collectively. So I appreciate the attention, and I'll share my slides now. And then as I'm talking, if folks have questions, feel free to interrupt me. I want this to be a conversation as well, but I'll, if it flows better, I'll also leave time at the end for more in-depth conversation and understanding. So let me go over here first.
Looks good.
Okay, great. And then let me share my full set of slides. And so you're not seeing, you're seeing the full set of slides, is that right?
Yes, yes, good.
Awesome. Okay. Okay. So, um, most of my work is actually, it's conducted with research students, graduate and undergraduate students, and mainly focuses on, their sociocultural experiences, especially as they transition into a new college setting for the first time. So we focus on, the voices and experiences of low-income first-generation students of color primarily, but it also offers insights on students of different intersecting identities. And so to do this, we recognize that students don't come and exist in vacuums. So we use a cultural analysis, cultural frameworks to really understand how students are experiencing our educational spaces, our university spaces, our interactions, our messaging. And so that cultural analysis allows us to understand, right, that there's these larger cultural ideas that exist in US educational settings that, prompt us to ask questions like, who is a good student? What does that person look like? What do they think about? What are their worldviews? What is the purpose of an education, right? How those cultural ideas shape the practices and policies that we have in our institutions, right? From who we hire to how we build our curriculum, and these sorts of things. And then how those necessarily shape the interactions and that students have with faculty like myself, or staff or other peers, or even family members who are at home. And then ultimately what we're really interested in is how students then experience that at the psychological level. And so their well-being, their belonging, their performance are just some things that our lab sort of explores and examines. The reason why a cultural framework is really useful is that we know that these settings are not culturally neutral spaces. And in fact, that they promote really culture-specific ideas about what it means to be a good student and what the expectation is for students and what the purpose of an education is. So I'm going to give you one example of this. In this study, what we did was we sent out surveys to about 50 public and private institutions across the nation. And we asked them, and these went to the top level administrators because we thought that these folks represented, right, the values and priorities at institutions, especially because they make a lot of decisions that impact policy. And so these included deans, program directors, provost office folks. And we asked them to think about the most important skills that their academic institution expects students to develop in college. And so we gave them a list of these sort of independent expectations, like being self-expressive, right, being individually motivated, or these interdependent expectations, like working collaboratively, right, following traditions and norms. And what we found was that from those surveyed, again, across public and private institutions, and there was no difference really in these kinds of institutions, was that the overwhelming majority characterize those expectations as one of independence, right? So largely that they were expecting students to develop themselves as independent beings, right? To explore their interests, to be self-expressive, to engage in independent research. And while that's fine and all, I think what it suggests is that, again, that these spaces are not culturally neutral, right? But that they have certain expectations on how and what's the right way for students to develop once they get into those spaces. I think what's interesting and what we consider is that students also come with their own understanding about what it means to be a good student and what the purpose of an education is. So in a similar study, we looked at all income students at a private institutions at Stanford University. These are first year students, and we wanted to know what their reasons were for attending college, right? What's the purpose of them going to college? And so we asked first generation college students, and these are students whose parents have not graduated from a four-year university, and continuing generation college students who have at least one parent who has graduated from the four-year university. And we asked them about their reasons for going to college. And what you find is that, both are likely to endorse these sort of independent reasons for going to college, right, or motivation. So to become an independent thinker, to expand one's self-knowledge or understanding of the world, to explore their interests. And these are things that align with sort of university expectations. What we find is that continuing generation students are more likely than first-gen students to report these, although they're both high on these. But what's really interesting and where these groups diverge, right, are these more interdependent expectations for going to college, right? So for first generation students across racial backgrounds, at least in this study, they were more likely to say that they're going to college because they wanted to be a role model for their community, or to give back to the community, or to help their families financially after after they graduated. And so I just want to give you a voice of a UCSC student from one of our studies who kind of demonstrates this interdependent reason for going to college, right? So this is from a Latina student, and she says, "It's hard, los amo, los extraño. I love you and I miss you, but it's hard. I'm struggling and I know that it is hard for you too. But I want you to understand that I didn't go away to hurt you, so go away to college or to waste my time and money. I'm working so we can have a better future, so you can stop working, so you can lay back on the couch and watch your novelas, which are really dramatic, just soap operas in Spanish, without your bones creaking and my heart aching. And todo lo que hago es por ustedes. Everything that I do is for you." This is a reflection from one of the research studies that we've conducted around her motivations for going to college, and we had students express what kind of messages they wanted their families to know about their time in college. But you can see that, right, that part of the motivation for being in college is not just sort of this idea of exploring one's self-interest, but it's tied, right, necessarily to helping family and themselves have a better, more stable future as well. And so what we're really interested in is what happens then when students come with their understanding about the purpose in education, and then whether that matches or mismatches with the university's expectations for students. And so we draw from cultural mismatch theory to try to understand a little bit about those consequences. And what cultural mismatch theory suggests, right, is that students reap a lot of advantages when their model of self, so one of independence in this case, matches the university norms of independence, right? And what literature suggests pretty robustly is that from students who are from middle class or continuing generation or white backgrounds, right, that there are some seamless sort of expectations around independence that allow that transition to be a little bit smoother. And then conversely, students then reap disadvantages when their model of self, so if they endorse this model of interdependence, right, when it mismatches that norm of independence, right? And then literature, again, more robustly, this is characteristic of students from working class backgrounds, first generation backgrounds, Latinx students, Native students. And these are just some examples of that. So I just want to give you an example of what this looks like, right? And this is a really super fun study that has, I think, a lot of insights so about this cultural mismatch. So in this study, we did it at both Stanford University and University of Arizona. We expose incoming first-year students, both first generation and continuing generation students, to a welcome letter from the university. So it's a standard letter that you would get in your welcome package. And then what we did, though, is we manipulated whether they saw either mostly independent messages or one that had some independence, but more integrating of interdependent messages. And so let me give you an example of what it looks like. So this is an example text of the independent letter, right? So it says something like, "I'm delighted that you have decided to attend the University of Arizona, that you think Arizona is the right place for you. And then for the next few years, you will have many opportunities to explore new areas and to learn from our superb faculty and from your own personal exploration, individual experiences as a student." So largely mapping on to what we've seen in welcome letters. We didn't have to tweak it that much, actually, because this is what exists in terms of the language in welcome letters. And again, mapping onto that idea of expectations for independence. So they either see this letter or they're randomly assigned to see a letter that still has those messages of independence, but small, subtle reframings to include messages of interdependence, right? So I'm delighted that you and your family have decided to attend U of A. For the next few years together with University of Arizona community, you'll have many opportunities to learn from your experiences, interactions with your peers, right? So we kept everything consistent, right? It's also signed by the university president, but we forged that because we wanted it to look like a real letter. And then we asked students to give some of their feedback, but mainly we asked them to measure their performance, right? So under the guise that we had them review, this was sort of like under the cover story of review incoming materials for next year's orientation. So read this letter, give us feedback, and then take this icebreaker activity and let us know how you think about it. But realistically, we wanted to see their performance on this and whether the letter messaging influenced their performance. And so on this task, it's called the tangram task. What you do is you take these pieces of the puzzle, and you have to rearrange them to create those shapes. It's actually really difficult. They do 9 puzzles in 10 minutes. And I think accurately people can finish around 1.5 to 2 puzzles. But it allows us to measure quite a different things here. So what did we find here, right? So I just want to orient you a little bit. At the bottom here is the independent letters, and then we have the interdependent letter. And on the y-axis here, we have the number of tangrams that were solved. And so and then we have first gen students and continuing generation students. So what we found was that when you include these messages of independence, again, the regular kind of messaging that exists in letters, you get the same socioeconomic achievement gap that you get at most universities, right? That first gen students underperform compared to continuing gen students. What's really interesting though is that if you start to expand that language and include more of these sort of messages of interdependence, that gap is actually eliminated. Those bars look different, but they're not. They actually do equally well as continuing generation students when they get those messages of interdependence. What's also interesting is that first gen students who get messages of interdependence do better than when first gen students get messages of independence. And I think most importantly to here, right, is that there's actually no adverse consequences for continuing gen students. Again, those bars look different, but they're not statistically. They do great in both conditions for continuing gen students. So what it suggests, at least from this study, is that, and we replicated across other things and also in longitudinal designs, is that when you privilege norms of independence, right, you actually undermine the performance of an entire really diverse group, right? In this case, first generation students. But when you start to expand, right, what it means to be a student, what the expectations are for going to college, right, to include more of this other model of interdependence, not only do you support, right, first generation students, but you also don't undermine, right, the performance of continuing generation students in this case. So what it does suggest is there's just more inclusiveness, right, about what it means to be in college then. Um, and so partly what we're interested in is understanding how a cultural mismatch not only impacts performance, because that's really important right, when we think about some parts of education, but also their mental health and their mental well-being, right? So I want to just give you an example of what this looks like, right? So this was an interview with a Latino male first gen student from a working class background. And when we asked him about what it felt like to go to college and be successful and making it into this sort of new kind of domain, this was his response. So he says, "My parents have greatly suffered in the course of time. There are times where I felt that it would be impossible for me to succeed. I have such a connection with my family that I have felt much guilt coming to the university. I feel that I have such a luxury with independence and they are suffering every day. These thoughts have made me consider dropping out of college and start working full time to aid my family." I think what's interesting here, what it illustrates is that maybe for some students, right, that succeeding beyond the working class home can elicit some negative psychological reactions. Not always, right, but in some cases, and this is true potentially if this Latino student. And those are exacerbated by a few things, right? So, so for example, your deep connection with family, the realization that you're experiencing luxuries um, at the university, right, especially of independence, like freedom, right, like privacy, that maybe others aren't experiencing at home, and the simultaneous recognition that there are members at home who might be suffering. And for the students that we've spoken with, this includes, you know, material suffering. So for example, food and housing insecurity. It can be emotional distress related to some of those things. And of course, financial um, distress as well. And so what we're really interested in this set of work is understanding what happens then when students experience a cultural mismatch and how does that influence their more sort of mental health. And so what we study is a concept known as family achievement guilt. And the way that we define this is a socio-emotional tension, right, related to leaving family obligations behind to pursue college. We also tried to understand the ways that we can alleviate this, but I want you to understand a little more of the facets of what guilt are for some of these students. So this is drawn from interviews with 34 low-income first generation, mostly Asian and Latinx students at UC Santa Cruz, and they're, you know, in their all across their academic years from first, second, third, and fourth years. Also both transfer and first years or incoming students as well. And so when we asked them about experiences of guilt, what we noticed was 4 different facets of guilt, right? And so I won't go through all of them, but I'll give you some examples. So there was guilt related to experiencing privileges, right? This was the realization that students had more educational, social, academic, and financial opportunities than family members could enjoy back at home. And so this is from one Latinx student who shared that, "I'll be sitting with my friends in the meadows. looking at the campus that we have, it's super green and everyone's really cool and just like friendly and everyone is super smart. And I think that's not how it is back home. It's like almost a movie, some really cool resort where you get smart. I just feel like I shouldn't be here when my family is just not here. And so part of the recognition for students was that, they were enjoying some of these privileges, even though there were family members at home who could equally enjoy the same privileges. They were just as smart, they were just as hard working, right? But because of structural barriers and sexual inequity, members have not had the same kinds of privileges and opportunities to attend higher education. So for this student, right, and especially I think true at a place like Santa Cruz, because the campus is so beautiful and so different than I think some of the experiences of students when they come back home, that it could elicit this guilt related to those additional privileges not afforded to equally deserving family members. Students also talked about the guilt related to experiencing financial distress. And so this came out in two ways. So, covering the high cost of the university, right? So parents having to, even support them potentially if they could, or right, not being able to contribute to family financially, and that they couldn't hold the job the way that they could when they're during the summer, right? So they couldn't offer that same financial support. And so this is from a Latino student again, and he says, I was very scared because like my parents did have to pay some things like the beginning of the year. There was a whole orientation cost that was like $130 and like all the Green Hell bus tickets. I was just very, very regretful. I could have just stayed home and saved so much money, saved my parents so much money, and just taken on the debt myself. So there was guilt related to how much, right, the financial burden is with family. And although $130 doesn't seem like it costs a lot, especially from a university perspective, at least we know from our literature and other literature, right, that this is a huge financial barrier for families in terms of accessing programs on our campus and other campuses nationwide, obviously. Um, so some of the, work that we're still interested in is in thinking about these cultural mismatches, right? So for us, what are the in what ways do low-income Christian students encounter a mismatch in their everyday behavioral practices, right? So what are they doing and engaging in some of these things? So I'll show you a study that kind of highlights those behaviors every day that they're engaging in. And in what ways do these students enact independence? So is it just the case that all these students are sort of interdependent, that there's no ways of thinking about independence? And if they do enact independence, is it, does it align with the university norms of independence, or does it differ in some important ways? And then finally, and most importantly, right, how do we address these cultural mismatches to alleviate some of these consequences, but also create institutions that better reflect the students that we're serving? So let me start with the first question, right? The sort of the behavioral practices. And so again, this is drawing from in-depth interviews with low-income first-generation students of color. And we asked them about their sort of everyday commitments to family. What are they managing as full-time students? And so what we noted in those interviews was that they were engaging in 6 different forms of supporting family, and this is pretty heavy kind of family caretaking. And so I just want to offer a couple examples, right? So this is consistent finding with literature around the role of young bilingual children in particular around being language and financial brokers. So, translating really complicated material for family members. So this is Carla, who's a Latina first-gen student, and she says, I think honestly that I play like a big role in my family because since my parents do not speak English, I have to always be the one interpreting. Like usually I'm the one that goes into the computer and pay the bills or do like the phone calls and whatnot. And still while being over here in college, my dad still calls me and says, can you pay the car? So students often talked about engaging in these roles even while sometimes studying for an exam, right? Even having to sometimes pop out of an exam so that they can help them with an emergency situation. What's interesting is students also noted that sometimes the financial materials were so above their head, but yet because they were the only ones that went to college, it was assumed that they could understand some of these things as well. But they also noted that there was, while it brought a lot of, I think, pride to support the family in this way, it can be very stressful, right? Because the family members are relying on students with some pretty heavy tasks potentially, right? And then another example is sibling caretaking. So this is above and beyond just babysitting. I'm talking about students who are sharing that they did a lot of intensive care for their younger siblings, like making food for them, making sure they're fed, making sure they had their homework done, right? And so let me give you an example from Natalie. who's also a Latina first-gen student, and she said, my brother was constantly kind of rebelling against my mom. She didn't have an energy to deal with it, so I was kind of trying to, like, from long distance, trying to communicate with my brother, constantly trying to make him understand, kind of like mothering him when my mom was kind of tired and like doing her own thing. So Natalie's from a single parent home, right? And so to help her mom and to alleviate some of that burden and pressure, she tried to help support her brother. Others, for example, talked about, again, being worried that by going to college, who was going to take them to work or to school, right? Who was going to feed them? What we argue here in these sort of interdependent commitments is that, students are bringing an incredible amount of wealth. I mean, these are incredible life skills that we don't think about in the classroom. And so the mismatch here is not only that they have these interdependent commitments, right? And that the university is sort of not acknowledging them, which creates further attention, right? Because now students have to choose between taking a test or studying for a test or helping family members, and that creates a lot of stress for students. But part of the mismatch here and the tension as well, right, is that we're ignoring a set of assets and a set of strengths that students are bringing and not necessarily thinking about how they translate into classroom environments or into leadership positions at the university or whatever it is that we might be thinking. I think that's another consequence of potentially privileging norms of independence. Um, as for, part of that research work was also trying to understand, well, are these students also engaging in independence, right? And so to do this, we look to literature. This is ethnographic work, and they have, some of these scholars have a framework that looks at soft and hard forms of independence. This is class-based independence. So what it suggests, and this is with pre-K students, what it suggests is that what they did was actually follow families from New York, and this was in Queens and also in Manhattan. And what the ethnographer, what the researcher found was that in the upper middle class families of Manhattan, they demonstrated what this is known as soft independence, right? Where children were actually taught to be sort of self-expressive, right? To express their opinions, to engage in independent thought. And so parents largely regarded their young children as these sort of delicate flowers that you had to water to allow bloom. And part of that watering is asking questions, allowing them to make choices on their own. And largely, they also saw some of this in the same middle to upper class schools, right, where choice was a really important part of their development and socialization. In contrast, right, this is Audrey Clouseau's work. What she found in the Queen's homes, right, was what she called more of hard independence. And so what hard independence is this sort of uncertainty about the world, right? So that it's not around self-expression, but more around following rules and norms, because there's no safety net to catch you if you take too big of risk, right? So because of financial limited resources, students are taught to be tough, to be smart about the world, especially if it feels uncertain, right? So it's not around choice, right? Because choices are limited when material wealth is limited. But in here, it's really about navigating and be tough and surviving an uncertain world here. And so we wanted to know whether, low-income first-generation college students demonstrated these forms of independence. And what we found was largely, yes, they did both, right? So as you're coming in, they showed 4 different forms of soft independence. And I'll just give you an example, right? So a large majority of them talked about how in being in college, you had to access more freedoms, right? So being able to choose your own schedule, make their own choices, have new opportunities. And so this is Angela, and she says, I don't have my own room at home. I had to share with my sister, so I didn't feel like I had privacy. Coming here, it gave me that privacy. When I'm here, like I can always go out for walks. I can walk, I can go to the store, I can get the bus and feel safe, So that feels very nice, just to be able to go out and not be scared that someone's going to point a gun at you and tell you, hey, give me all your money. I show this example because while students are demonstrating and noting forms of soft independence, it's also the case that these experiences are very much informed by their working class backgrounds, right? So yes, they're engaging in having more freedoms, right? But for them, it includes having more space, having more privacy. Some students talk, for example, when they're at home, they're trying to study in these cramped living quarters, right? And they're able to do it because they're very resilient, obviously. But that in coming to a university space, which makes the university even more important, right, is having dedicated space to do the things that you need to do as a student. As another example of that, students did talk about engaging in self-expression. So Frank was a Latino student that I remember very well because he came into the interview with bright pink hair. And I hadn't seen anything that bright before. And so, but it was also something that made him very proud and very happy to do, because for the first time in going to college, he was able to explore parts of his identity that felt hidden to him for a long time. And what was interesting, though, it came with some tension, though. So when he went back home for the first time after his hair was dyed, his family remarked on it, right? Because it was different. And so, you know, part of this engaging in self-expression has to be renegotiated when you go back into the working class home, right? Because family members aren't there with you as you're growing. So they're learning a different side of yourself. So it did come with some interpersonal conflict, right? Some of his family members accused him of acting white, right? Of expressing parts that they had not seen from him before. And so I think this what makes self-independence really interesting, because students are adapting to this new socialization, but still have to renegotiate some of that when they go back home. What's also interesting is that these students are showing, again, forms of hard independence, right? So this is different than what we expect students in university settings. This is much informed by working class selves. So let me give you an example. So students often talked about having to be tough for family, right? So expressing some kind of toughness so in forms of protection. So this is from Rose. And Rose says, to this day, my mom doesn't know that I struggled in college. At least in my culture, you're taught to be a strong woman. What I love about this quote, though, is that it's a form of independence, but it's necessarily tied to connection to family. So students talked about, for example, you know, they're being tough because they know things are stressful at home. And when they're struggling, they don't want to put more undue stress on family members back at home. So for them, it's a way of loving family, of protecting family. But obviously, it's very stressful when you're having to hold in some of that struggle, right, and keep it from family potentially. So I think it's an interesting form of independence, right, that potentially has some consequences, even though it comes from a place of love, obviously, from students. So I think what these interviews helped us understand is that on the daily experience, students, these low income first generation students of color, are experiencing cultural mismatches because they're engaging in heavy support of family while having to also think about the demands of being a university student, right? And that's a different experience if you're not engaging in those same kinds of family behaviors. But also their forms of independence are different, right? There's another level of cultural mismatch here when our university potentially prioritizes self-expression, right, or independent thought, and yet these students are engaging in some of that, but also engaging in these hard forms like being resourceful, being self-reliant, right, being tough. So I think there's a lot of room here to think about institutional practice as a way to capture the great strengths that students are bringing with them that we don't currently capture right now. And so what that sort of, I think for us, propels us to think about is how we can use the culture cycle approach to really then rethink our institutional practices, rethink our cultural ideas about what it means to be a student, what it means to serve students. So what I like about the culture cycle is it also allows places for intervention, for culture shifting, right? So it propels us to ask bigger questions like, what ideals and values do we have to embrace if we're going to serve a diverse class of students? What are the practices, policies, and programs that need to be adopted and implemented, right, to better serve students? What interactions do key stakeholders like faculty, staff, right, administrators need to do to foster, right, for us in the end, belonging, performance, mental health, right, for students. Ultimately, the goal here is to think about how we can empower students to feel, right, like they belong. They're not like they're guests in someone else's home. And that cultural mismatch, I think, is a really key part because, right, it signals to students that, you know, if your culture is not represented here, you don't belong here. And so there's little things that we can do. And part of our research work is trying to figure out what those interventions are to shift the culture of institutions to better reflect or better support students through that transition and navigation through college. So I just want to offer a couple examples broadly, and then I'll go into one in depth, just so you have a sense of what's happening on our campus and some of the really, really amazing critical work that's a lot of folks are doing on our campus. So in one study right here, we developed, this is with graduate students and a team of undergraduate students, we facilitated a 2-hour interactive conversation with low-income first-gen students of color after their first year of college. And the whole point here was to talk through the cultural transition to college. So what we did was we actually introduced a lot of this research work. We gave them language for their experience. We exposed them to community members, including, senior students, so that they can create connection, graduate students, myself as faculty, right? So they can build some of their social capital. Um, and so then in this case, in this study, it's a case study of that 2-hour conversation. What's nice about this kind of research approach is that it can be implemented in existing things like orientation or programs that help support low-income first generation students. And we learned a lot about how to improve a program like this, and also things that were helpful. One of the most helpful things, right, was just for students to understand that they weren't alone in some of the things that they were experiencing, right? So they didn't feel isolated. And so having that interactive community conversation helped them have a sense of community. And another approach, right, when we think about institutions, this is a collaboration with CSU Los Angeles, and we're also running the intervention here on our campus, is to unpack some of these hidden things from students, right, in scalable ways. So what we do here is we create student stories in video format, and we exposed them at the very beginning of the year, and then we tie them to students' experiences. So for example, there are students who are low income first generation and students of color who talk about what it's like to go to office hours. What are office hours for? What's the point of them? So the goal here is to not make assumptions about what students already know before they come in, but make very concrete what the expectations are for students, right? And then allow them the agency to decide if they want to engage in some of those practices. What's really exciting is that we're doing this, we just launched these stories, which we're calling the storytelling intervention, because it includes, 5 UCSC students talking about their first year. But we just launched this to our incoming class this past fall. So about 4,500 students just listened to the stories, and now we're going to follow them through that first year of college to see how they're doing in that transition.
Right. Rebecca, you might
Yes.
say a little more about what office hours means.
Oh yeah. Oh, see, that's a great point. I can also, so office hours are what faculty hosts so that we have a chance to connect with students. It's interesting because the video is like 2 minutes long and it allows students to understand what office hours are. Um, but it's a chance to come talk to faculty about the class, the research work, their journeys. So every faculty hosts at least 1 hour a week, and they can be open, students can just pop in. Obviously now they're virtual, but in the past, right, faculty will be in their office, and students, or anybody actually, undergrad and graduate students, can pop in, make an appointment, and talk about any kind of feature or aspect. What we do know is that they're very scary for students because faculty can be quite intimidating, at least appearingly so. And so part of actually this project here was to make it to really make concrete what office hours are, how you can navigate them, and that we as faculty really want to hear from you to make them a little bit less scary for students. And it had great impact. So when we ran this at CSU LA, which it's a minority serving institution, serves large numbers of first generation low income students. They found those kinds of suggestions and tips incredibly helpful because they could learn right away, right, what the point of office hours were. And the goal here is kind of even the playing field, because for students whose families have gone to college, right, many of them are familiar with that process. And so now, in being able to share these hidden rules, right, we say hidden because that information is familiar to some set of students who have the privilege and cultural capital of the college navigation system, and some do not. By making them very visible, then students can at least have equal access to some of that information. Thank you for that. In this other example, this is a partnership with their Hispanic serving institution. So if you're not familiar, UC Santa Cruz does have HSI designation. It just means that our student body is at least 25% Latinx. We're also an enrolling or emerging minority serving institution, meaning that we serve at least 50% minority students, racially, ethnically minority students. What's also really interesting is that UCSC is one of 22 institutions nationwide that is both a Hispanic serving institution and a research intensive institution. So it has incredible capacity and potential for providing transformative research experiences for minoritized groups. And so this was in collaboration with HSI. I spoke a little bit earlier about some of the financial distress and guilt related to going to college. And so taking some of that research work, we worked with HSI to create a program that was a family-based conference for low-income first-generation Latinx students and their families in their home neighborhoods, completely free, half day, every food is free, right? Enrollment is free. And so that we can reduce some of the costs related to parents having to take off work, for example, is during the weekend. And then also cost of travel, we covered all of that. Completely bilingual, it was both attended by students and parents. But the hope here was to create a culturally relevant space for students to learn about the cultural transition to college. So part of the research work here was to conduct surveys and interviews with students and families who attended to see what was most effective. And overwhelmingly, I'll just share one finding was that it reduced a lot of stress related to financial pressures for students and families because they also got to meet with the financial advisor for 15 minutes. And that did so much, I think, in terms of relieving some of that stress. What's also great is they also got to connect with, so this is a picture of a family panel of previous family members who had a first-gen student go to college and what that was like, how much they missed them, how they had to renegotiate some of the family roles and how they could better support their families. So it was an institutional kind of practice in response to better supporting right a diverse population. And so now it's in its, I think, 5th year, and it's doing great in terms of connecting families. I think it serves around 100 students and their families every year. It doesn't replace orientation, but it supplements it with and it thinks about program access really carefully by making sure that everything is free. And then this is one I'll give you more in depth. So I'm not sure if you're familiar, but the UC campuses is part of a grassroots effort at UC Irvine from a faculty member there who was first generation, adopted this first gen visibility campaign. If you are yourselves first generation, there are free shirts that are welcome to you if you're excited to wear that. The whole point here was to highlight positive representation so that we can humanize key leaders at the university, including graduate students, staff, administrators, and faculty who are also first generation. So myself, for example, I'm first generation. I would wear this T-shirt on the first day of classes. I would share my first gen story, and the hope that it would humanize a little bit of who we are and have students connect with us a little bit better. So in this research project, we evaluated whether that was the case. So let me just show you a little bit. So we decided to do this because we know that these kinds of visibility campaigns are increasing nationwide, right? Especially as we're serving more and more numbers of first-gen students. And yet there's no existing evaluation of whether these things are effective, right? So we're doing these practices in institutions and sometimes we don't know if it's actually the right practice. And so part of the research work was to figure out if this is actually effective. And so we wanted to know what's the impact of this kind of visibility campaign on student belonging. And so what we did was in this research study, we brought students into the lab online, actually, sorry, they did an online survey and we exposed them to one of 2 websites. The websites are normal kind of faculty profiles that you would see on anyone's faculty webpage, right? So it tells you a little bit, oh, actually, I think I have yeah, okay, good. So they actually, what they're randomly assigned to see is actually all information is the same, except in one website, they're identified as first gen, and on the other, they're not identified as first gen, they're identified as continuing gen. So they see one of 2 of these stories, so first gen faculty or continuing generation faculty. They see 4 different faculty. You might actually recognize Juan Poblete because I think he was one of your former speakers here, so we used him. What's really interesting is that these faculty are actually all first gen themselves, so they're part of our profiles. So we had to make them non-first gen for the other manipulation. And then what they read, right, is an about me section, advice to students, and then also the research interests. Again, it's supposed to mimic regular profiles that you see on our websites. So it could see something like, both of my parents completed high school, but I was the first in my family to go to college. This makes me extra proud to be first gen woman in STEM. And so a lot of the folks have these similar stories. Again, we used 2 women, 2 men, and we tried to, have 2 people of color, 2 white people. And so we were very mindful about also their majors to make them much more relatable to students as well. And then we had students complete measures of belonging and relatability. And so what we found, right, all I want to just show you here is that they're exposed to those conditions. So either faculty, first gen faculty or continuing gen faculty, right? The same profiles, which is say whether they're first gen or not. What we find is that for first gen students who are exposed to first gen faculty, they see them as much more relatable and also report increased belonging as a result of reading those first gen faculty. We also measured their intention to visit office hours, and the same is true, right? So for first gen students, first gen faculty more relatable, and they were then more likely to come or have intentions to go to office hours. What I like about this study is that it offers a mechanism for why those things happen. It's relatability. So even if you're not first gen, if you can be more relatable to your students. And so we have a lot of non-first gen faculty who participate in our visibility campaign. And so what they do is actually share struggle stories. So while they're not first gen, they might say that, you know, I'm a math teacher and I used to struggle with math. And this is how I overcame it. And those things seem, and we know this from research, are very effective for becoming more relatable and also producing belonging for students. So and gave us some evidence, right, that these visibility campaigns with the small institutional, right, commitment, I mean, they're t-shirts and you share your story. In this case, we're just assessing website profiles, that it had this tremendous capacity of breeding connection for our students. What's really interesting is that you have to highlight the first gen identity. It can't just be that you say that we're diverse faculty, because first gen is such a hidden identity. You don't know who's first gen or not. So bringing that to the sort of making it more salient, bringing it to the forefront is really essential for producing some of those positive effects. I say that all to share that there's so many different ways with the culture cycle to produce change, right? From small little changes to wording on welcome messages to, you know, larger institutional commitments like, you know, supporting a family conference, right? I mean, these are all things that are really critical for supporting first generation low income students of color. And also generally what we find in our research work, all students from backgrounds, right? That it doesn't negatively harm them. In fact, it actually produces benefits for more traditional students. Part of this kind of culture shift work or intervention work is making sure that we're sharing it with campus audiences, right? So, you know, we share a lot of the research findings through research briefs if you're ever interested in reading them, right? So this was at University of Delaware. This is here our circulation from the Students Success Equity Research Center, right? They're meant to be accessibly written, sent out, very brief, just ways of sharing more about the research work. With students, we've also created these infographics, right? This is from that case study that I talked about of the 2-hour conversation. We created these booklets for faculty, staff, and families about how they can better support their family. There's some beautiful, beautiful stories from our students. We also, you know, give talks on our campus. My students and I give talks. So this is from the Teaching Academy, where we worked with faculty on how to better support students by resisting stereotypes. We create videos, some with students, some with myself, telling about the research on how to navigate the first generation, or sorry, the transition to college. And we use student stories as part of that navigation as well. So my last thing that I'll just kind of wrap up, I like sharing this because I think it summarizes the main point of the findings and the research work. So I'm going to share this quote with you and then tell you a little bit more about it. So this is from Rose, again, from one of the interviews that I mentioned earlier. And she's a Latina first-gen student, and she says, I'm working hard towards this goal of graduating college, but even this goal is not solely just for myself. I want to help out my parents. I want to support them, so even then you never become fully independent. And you know, what I love about this quote, right, is that what it's sort of showing us here, right, is that if we don't fully sort of recognize all the sort of ways of being, ways of thinking of students, right, that we're sort of missing not only an incredible amount of wealth and strength, right, but we're also undermining the performance and belonging and mental health of some of our students. And so the research work shows, right, that while, you know, universities might privilege one way of thinking, right, one of independence, our students come with vast understandings about what it means to be a student and the purpose of an education, right? So forms of hard independence, interdependent commitments. What I love about what Rose is saying is she's thinking about, you know, making things a little bit bigger here, right? Is that the expectation to become independent that is so, I think, prioritized in institutional settings, right, can never fully be reached actually, right, when your daily lived experience is about remaining connected to family, committing to supporting your family members. And so what Rose is helping us do is call attention, right, to a bigger question here, right, to really recognize different ways of being, but asking the question around what ideals and values do we have to embrace as an institution, right, if we're truly going to serve a diverse group of students here. And so we have to think very carefully about what kinds of cultural practices and policies and ideas that we're going to privilege in those space, if we're going to be an institution that thinks about educational equity and living sort of in a multicultural, diverse society. And so as I wrap up and we have time, hopefully for questions, maybe for about 20 minutes, I just want to thank, obviously, this is my lab, the CoLab. The CoLab is a space where we engage in this research work with students, right? So these are both undergrad and grad students.
I am in the woods with some water going in the background near my house. In the next 30 seconds, I'm going to show
Let me see if I can.
Look at the numbers.
No worries.
Only 29% of Americans now approve of the job that Mr. Trump is doing. That's by far the lowest rating of this presidency.
Somebody's
And
got
among
the radio
Republicans,
in here.
approval of Mr.
I think
Trump
it might be
has
Harriet.
gone from 77% in August to 60%.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay, I did it.
And just very quickly, I just want to say thank you to the collaborators, the participating students in schools, because I mean, these stories are difficult. I mean, often we ask our students to take surveys, complete these interviews, and it's a lot of labor. And I always just want to recognize the labor that schools and students put into, some of this research work. And obviously you all for your attention, any insights that you bring, any of your own personal stories that resonate or don't resonate, I welcome that conversation. And there are just some resources here. If you're interested in learning more about my own research lab, the CoLab, or the university's research center, the Student Success Equity Research Center, this is where we actually partner with a lot of campus practitioners, right? So different programs that serve students to evaluate the practices, but also conduct new research around student success in a more holistic way, with the goal of creating research findings that we can put into action. And students are a really, really big key component of that work. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing at that point. And let me end this.
Okay, and we'll go. Well, that was excellent, Rebecca, and just so interesting to really think about things I think we do not think about. So brings up lots of questions, I'll bet. So the easiest way maybe is if you want to have a question, make sure your video is on. Just raise your hand, and I will call on you. So questions. Nancy's a psychologist, Rebecca.
Yay, great.
Oh, you're muted, Nancy.
Yes, I'm very interested in these things. And one of the things you're talking brought to my mind. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I can. Mm-hmm.
Okay. My daughter's been doing contact tracing for the COVID, and it's become clear that every case that she has traced goes back to a family situation where many people are living in very, pretty tight quarters. And it occurs to me that a lot of these students may have grown up in situations like that, where their family interactions were so much more notable, I guess I'll say, or marked than what many of us experienced as youngsters. So I just think that very much bears on this situation. That's all.
I appreciate that. I think that's absolutely true. And in fact, we know from research work, for example, that low-income neighborhoods, there's less mobility, for example, more people living, more generations living in a home. Even in particular in low-income Latinx literature, for example, more participation in family events. You tend to live closer to home as well. So there's a lot of documentation about the living situations of the groups that we study. Another thing that I just will mention is that we have several studies right now understanding the COVID impacts of low-income first-generation students of color, and it's pretty nuanced in the sense that folks are having to go back home and having to now support families in new ways while now trying to do online learning, and it's very complicated. That boundary of having enough resources to even study as a student, it's difficult, but it does bring attention around why having dorm space, why it's so important to have students in our physical campus, obviously. But students, there's another piece of it is that students now feel even closer to family being at home, because now some of them are inviting them to their online sessions. So And so now parents have a better example of what they're doing and what they're learning. It just depends, obviously, it's very case by case, but it's a very nuanced kind of impact of COVID. But it is very, very challenging for those same reasons, is that, you know, you're sharing a lot of resources. And in some cases, those are very limited. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, Barbara, and unmute.
Hi, thank you. My name is Barbara, and I was a first generation student, and I remember a lot of issues that you are talking about, certainly not all. But number one, I would love to get a T-shirt, because when I come
Oh,
on
yay.
campus, I would love to wear that T-shirt. That's one question. Is there a way that I could do that?
Yes. Can I let everyone know, if you're interested in this shirt, I'm going to put the email on, and you can join our share listserv, so you can see other speakers who focus on first gen work, and you can learn more about our visibility campaign. Right now, we're actually engaging in a research project where we're having first gen students engage in research work as a transformative experience. But if you want a T-shirt, for example, email them and let them know that you heard about it through this talk and that you just want a T-shirt, and they'll get mailed out to you.
Okay. And the other thing is that I was wondering, is there any way, any aspect of this that you think that our organization, that I, for example, could participate in this with students? Or in your
Oh my God, there's so much. Yeah. So, I mean, I think one thing that's really incredible is, you know, a lot of our work looks at the transition to and through college, but more and more so, we're actually now looking at that transition out of college. And there's very, I think, little, you know, there's little research on that, but also then more need for more mentoring, for example, of those students. So for example, if you're in a particular career, a particular major, the ability to connect with some of our students, especially as they're going through that transition out of college, is immensely, I think, beneficial for learning, and just having another person to talk to it about, obviously. You know, a lot of the programs that we support through the First Generation Initiative, and I'll just send that website out so you can take a look. I'm going to put them in here as well. You know, those are, they're very small things, right? But they have big impacts. So encouraging research and doing the visibility campaign, doing programming for students like dinners, for example, or doing student sessions or workshops. Right now we have a graduate student who's first gen, for example, who's leading workshops on how to navigate graduate school for first gen students. So we're trying to support students along the pipeline. But, you know, donating money, for example, to these programs is also another way if you don't have time to contribute, for example. But there's so many ways of getting involved, and I'm happy to connect folks with some of these initiatives as well. So anywhere from mentoring to having, like, you know, a dinner conversation to donating to some of the programs are fantastic ways to support our students. But if you want to learn more, visit the website, and there's more information about our programming there.
So in the chat, it's just a question of how many first gen are there. So raise your hand if you are a first gen student. How many we got in here?
Oh, that's fantastic. This is great.
Well, not really. My father did go to college for a while.
Okay. Other questions? Other questions?
Well, we define first gen on our campus as not completing a 4-year degree. So if you have parents who went to an associate's, for example, you're still considered first gen, because it's the 4-year experience that you get from a parent that helps you navigate that setting.
So Constantine, did you have a question? Unmute yourself. You did. No, you're muted, Constantine.
Okay. Now I have it. So my interest is there any way, now that we have this wonderful software and this kind of system that we have, is there any way, since we're always talking about funding and the financing of all the students, is there any way to reduce the cost of education of first gen using this new software like Zoom or any other similar things at all in the university? Any studies going on? You know,
Yeah,
God forbid we would reduce the costs of education.
No, I know. I think it's complicated. There's extensive literature on educational equity and online learning. And so it's not the case that when you move things online that all of the sort of inequity exists. In fact, it costs a lot of money to create equitable learning experiences in an online format. So you have to invest a lot of resources, and oftentimes universities don't think about that. They think about it as like a really like a maybe cost-effective way without putting all the resources in it immediately. But you know, the engagement of students, for example, is in consideration, even in teaching. You know, a lot of us don't have a lot of experience in teaching online, and yet we're learning, especially during this COVID moment. And so we did actually a research project last spring, and we interviewed 15 senior students, again, who didn't opt into learning because this is during COVID sort of emergency situation. And you know what, it's nuanced. So, you know, they told us that what was really great is that, you know, you could access the materials at any time. So, you know, often if their classes are fast paced, they can then go later and listen to the recording, and that accessibility was incredible. They really welcomed that. The difficult part was then motivation, right? So to take all your online courses felt like, oh, if I know I can do it later, then I shouldn't go right now, and then getting backed up. So it's sort of like it's a balance. But we do know, right, that students, at least from those interviews and from other literature work, that the in-person connection is quite important for belonging. So I think our online group here at Santa Cruz is considering these things, right? How do we make online platforms more equitable? How do we, but keeping our in-person learning, but then providing online opportunities for students who are working, right? So that it is more expansive. One of the biggest complaints we got from our students under COVID was that they're paying the same tuition for now online learning. And that has been a really big source of, I think, frustration and resentment.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is this going up to the university level, the higher level, where people there are considering reducing the cost if you choose one or the other? Is there something like that happening, or no?
I think those conversations are happening. Jody Green, who I think was one of your former speakers as well, she's the faculty director of the Center for Innovations of Teaching and Learning. So our learning center, which is doing incredible work. I'm a faculty fellow of that center and on the steering committee, has, you know, constantly working with our institutional research office to send surveys to see how our students are doing, and then taking that information and making sure it's getting to the right hands of people who are making these decisions. So also working with our online learning office to make sure that we're considering that when developing training programs for our faculty.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so who else has a question? And you know, the complication here is I can only see a third of you on the screen. So all right. So I know Janice has a question, and anybody I'm looking on my other screens, and Naomi has a question. Anybody else? Okay, so, well, Janice, go first, and then we'll come.
I appreciate your comments as a first-gen student, and I wonder if you have an opportunity to talk with or make others who are not first-gen students aware of the challenges of first-gen students. I can remember when I was in school thinking, you have no idea what it took for me to get here.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And I think our students feel exactly the same way. And in fact, yes, the answer is yes. So I work very closely with our HSI team, our CITL team. So for example, every year we do a workshop with all our incoming new faculty. We do workshops for our staff, our advisors on inclusive language and learning and interactions, right? So a lot of our work is the translatable equity talks that we give not only in our campus, but nationwide. So NASPA, for example, is a National Student Affairs Association, and that's where many universities come in, their administrators and top level administrators come. And so giving workshops there around what this experience is like. So a very similar talk, but tailored to different audiences, different universities. So, you know, the students and I are very committed with other partners on getting this information out there, because I think it's how culture shift happens, right? It's the people who are not aware, but still making decisions that need to know a little bit more about the experience and the strengths that we're not really tapping into. I appreciate that question very much.
Okay, and Naomi, and then Sarah.
Hi, Rebecca. Thank you for this talk. I'm part of a group of people, many of whom are OLLI members, who are mentors in the Puente program at Cabrillo College. And I would love it if there's some resources on how to be the most effective mentor that I can be, particularly for Latinx students. So if you can direct me to those resources, that would be superb.
Yes. What's also really great is that So this is also similar to what we do with HSI. I'm putting my email address in there if folks want to just email me for some of this as well. Right now, we're actually working with 2 programs. So one is the Building Belonging program on our campus. It's a fantastic program that's funded by donation givers. It's meant to serve 100 minoritized students. So this is low income first generation students of color to engage in research. And part of what we're assessing is the mentoring part. So are they getting their mentoring needs? Was it sufficient? And so we're learning a lot from the research angle around mentoring and pulling from already existing literature on that. We're also evaluating what one of our programs with first-gen students on their research experience is called. It's a PAR program, meaning that it's participatory action research. That means the students conduct all elements of the research. And so we're learning more about their mentoring needs as well from that. And so I'm happy to share some of those findings at a later time if folks are interested in that. But there's existing work on, what it means to be an equity-minded mentor, for example. And we've implemented some of that in some of the existing HSI work. So I'm happy to share some of those findings or some readings that help with some of that, because it's an interesting question that is another core line of our research. But the program is fantastic. I've met a lot of scholars from there, and it's so great. I know it's changed a lot of lives of students as well. Thank you for supporting students.
Okay, Sarah Walsh and then Mark. And unmute, Sarah. No, you're still muted. Go.
Okay, there you go. Well, I want to thank you for this talk. I worked on campus for many years as an academic advisor, and I was particularly glad to work with these students. I was a first gen myself, and it was before there was even, these kind of designations which even make you feel as part of you're part of a group. You're just not on your own wandering. But what I want to say is that you mentioned a little bit about reaching out to faculty, their orientations to faculty, and that was kind of, for me, the big barrier for many students. I knew of half a dozen faculty that I would routinely send students to who I knew were compassionate and resourceful, but not necessarily across the whole academic spectrum. Right. And so many students they're so intimidated by it, and some faculty, they're dismissive of students who aren't in their particular mindset. So I just want to continue to encourage you to keep educating faculty. That there's a lot they can do to really improve the academic performance and personal commitment. And I just had some brilliant students who worked so hard from great difficulties. They can do it, but a lot of faculty don't understand that the kids have to go home and take care of their siblings while their parents are working or they're in the hospital. I mean, they have full family responsibilities in so many cases. And just keep educating those faculty.
I agree. Yes. I mean, because faculty play such a critical role in the mentoring lives of our students in the classroom, for example, the gateway opportunities available for students. And what's been really incredible is through not only the HSI initiatives that we've evaluated and worked on, but also through the first gen work, is that, and now with CITL, now Jody Green's doing fantastic things to transform the culture of faculty on our campus. But through all these partnerships, what's been really great is that we've had so much interest among faculty. And that might be because we're constantly hiring new faculty as well. But I think there's another narrative around what it means to support diverse students. So that interest is growing. But obviously there's, I think, still, some resistance in some departments and among, maybe other faculty or maybe who are not as keen or aware of this. And I think some of that continues to work. But I absolutely agree that a key, I think we're a key group of stakeholders that need to, get on board of this if we're going to shift anything in the culture of our institutions. Thank you for that. I work really closely with advisors too. It's such an amazing group to work with. So I appreciate you sharing more about your advising history.
So we had a couple of Marks, but Mark Levy had a question. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for a really enlightening presentation. It was wonderful. I too am first gen, and I also taught high school for many decades. And many of my first gen students did not elect or could not go to university or college and elected to stay home elected is almost too nice a word for it.
Right.
Stay home and support their families with either menial jobs or taking care of siblings. They now are having children, or they have had children. And I'm curious to know if any work is being done about second gen students who are now maybe gathering the momentum to do what their first gen parents could not.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, yes, I think even our own, if Margarita at Smithia hasn't had a chance to come visit, I'm not sure if we've invited her. She has this incredible 11-year study of first gen students. So she's been following students through now, I think now they're in the phase where they're parents now. And these are the same set of students that she caught right before they went into to college. So she has an incredible resource and data set, and she's been fantastic. But there is her work not only comes to mind, but also I think there's a couple of other longitudinal projects, long-term ones from national data sets that also speaks to this. I don't conduct that work, but I'm just less familiar with it, but it's absolutely that. I mean, right now we're doing a study with high school students and following them just 1 year. But I'm already seeing some of those decisions, right? That push out factor of like, I really want to go to school for my family, but this right now to get a job is much more immediately important. And what does it mean to support students so that they're able to do both potentially? But it's been very, I think, difficult and challenging, I think, for students to make that decision. But I appreciate that, yeah. I guess I'm saying also that since you experience as a high school teacher, and it's still very similar in a lot of ways, but I know there's a lot of movement right now and a lot of change, but I mean, students are still grappling with the same kinds of decisions.
Okay, so I
Thank
think
you.
we'll just have a couple of more. Lots of questions, Rebecca. Pat asked, how many of the students are dreamers, and how can we support the dreamers?
Yeah, an incredible amount. In fact, we never actually have students identify, obviously, so they always self-identify, but so it's always an underreporting in our studies. But a good number that do, like I would say probably the majority of students that we work with are coming from immigrant backgrounds or families who are from working families as well. Our campus, I'm not sure if you're familiar, has an undocumented student services center that collaborates with our first gen center, and they have a robust programming to help support our first gen students on campus. We're also really careful in our programming that, for students who, for example, in our participatory action research project, we had students, for example, that, we have to pay, but we have to be careful about how we use payment. So we work with them really carefully and one-on-one to make sure that they can get payment, but in a way that still is careful to some of their status. So support, I think, is similar what I like about the First Gen Initiative is that it's an umbrella program that serves so much intersecting diverse identities, and a lot of that includes undocumented students. But again, I think similar kinds of support are funding, especially in times of crisis right now, mentoring support, learning more about students, right, and connecting with the programming. And I'm happy to share a lot of those resources, maybe in a follow-up email if that's helpful for folks.
Okay, maybe I'm going to ask the last one here. So, big political question of affirmative action. So, and of course, the recent, our last election voted against affirmative action again. So I'm an advocate myself. You're very much involved in this. Why should we support policies that have an affirmative action agenda?
I mean, I know a lot of work that I also study is just around what the benefits are of multiculturalism, not only for those who are minoritized, but for non-minoritized groups. And this is, in a more critical way. So for example, what I know from literature is that when our campuses are much more diverse, when they have diverse talent and perspectives, this improves intergroup understanding. It reduces bias, it reduces stereotyping. I mean, these are all really critical processes when I think about how divisive our society is right now. There's incredible work from psychology and also education called intergroup dialogues. Intergroup dialogues is this, it started at University of Michigan and now has other programming here, but it brings first year students and it's led by more senior students to have real conversations around difference and diversity and around equity and inequity and structural kinds of inequity that different groups are experiencing. It's fantastic. It's like, it makes people feel comfortable about talking around issues of race and social class, but it also humanizes what some of those experiences are. And so students remark on how many benefits they get from that kind of experience. So when I think about when I think about like why we should invest in, you know, diversifying our spaces and our settings, it's because there's so many benefits that come out, not only sense of belonging and engagement for the minoritized groups, right? But by minoritized, I mean low income first generation students of color. But, you know, reducing stereotyping, reducing bias, especially in these moments, right? Increasing intergroup interaction. It also has shown to improve academic performance in the long term for both groups, with better gains for minoritized students, right? Because there's more to gain, I think, in that case. But there's robust literature supporting a lot of that evidence about the diversity of students in the classroom and the benefits for students. So I'm hoping that answers your question, but I can't think of anything more important in terms of processes for stopping some of the, you know, I guess reducing some of the divisiveness that we have in our country. We have some, you know, even psychologists who study this at a very young age too, when we think about this kind of openness to diversity and studying in infants and even in early childhood. I just happen to study in the college setting because it's also a time of openness and learning. And also the first time where a lot of students are experiencing diversity, right? Because most of our high schools and elementary schools are quite segregated. So colleges become a place where it's almost like a reflection of how diverse our society is for the very first time. And this includes both white and non-white students.
Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. That was just all fabulous. Those people who told me I had to get you were absolutely right.
Thank you. That's very sweet.
Okay, Benita, you want to wrap it up?
Well, just say thank you again, Rebecca, from all of us. And we really appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to us. And it was very interesting, very educational, because as you probably know, we like to support students. We have a scholarship fund, so.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah. And to everybody else and Rebecca, stay well, stay safe. We'll see you next month, if not before. Don't forget to go to course.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you all. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
It was great.
Thank you for all you're doing for students. Thank you. Have a good long weekend. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.